Today we're going to be building a cutting board. Now it's not your basic run-of-the-mill cutting board, so don't worry about that. It's going to start off that way. It's going to seem pretty basic and simple, but what we're going to build is called a weave cutting board. So we're going to glue a bunch of strips together of different sizes, giving us a pattern that we like, and then we're going to cut it. And then we're going to glue it together, then we're going to cut it. And we're going to glue it together, and we're going to cut it. I think you get the point. So, the materials we're going to be using. We've got some walnut, we've got hickory, sapele, I've got some purple heart in here that we're going to probably find a place to stick it. We've got sapele and paduk. I think I already said one of those already, but either way, here's materials that we've got. I'm going to be using this combination. I think I'm going to probably heavily lean towards the main color being walnut, and I think I'm going to use some of the hickory as the weave pattern itself. I've only seen one other guy doing a board like this, and it turned out pretty good. I have never done a board like this myself, so I don't know if this is going to work. It might turn out really cool, and it might not. I just don't know. I don't know. It might work, it might not. We'll try. We'll see.
So after playing around with the pattern for a couple of minutes, I realized that I definitely needed more material options. So I cut some additional boards down to size, then I jointed one edge, and ripped them down to various widths from 1/4 inch to 3 inches, give or take. But before I could finish, I had a visitor. This is our golden retriever, Natasha, who has absolutely no fear of power tools and was apparently wet for some reason, which is a little disconcerting because it's not raining outside. Anyways, I just needed to finish cutting some 1/4 inch strips when the breaker tripped on my table saw. So I reset the breaker and tried again, but to no avail. So I just plugged it into a different circuit, and then I was able to finish making those cuts. Then it was time for what was probably the hardest part of this whole project, and that was figuring out what pattern to use for both the cutting boards. Honestly, I don't know why this takes me so long to find a pattern. It's a little like trying to find that special girl to marry you. You might date a few, but when you finally get it right, you just know that's the one. Or two in this case. Patterns, not wives, just so we're clear. Anyways, much like the vows of matrimony, it's time to make these boards into one by gluing them together. And dropping the glue brush on the floor first. 3-second rule. I think that still applies here. Then I squirt some glue and pushed it around. And then I tucked them into bed for the night using these panel clamps. I probably didn't need to add the third clamp in the middle, but I did it anyway. I also used the influencer to help align a few of the boards that were being stubborn, and since I knew I would be running these through the planer a few times, okay, more than a few times, I really wasn't worried about denting the wood by using a steel hammer at this point.
Now that we've got these all in the clamps, we're just going to let them dry, and we'll come back, we'll clean off some of the glue, run them through the planer, clean them up, and then we're going to cut them again, and then glue them back together, and then cut them and glue them back together until I feel like stopping.
The next day, I removed the clamps, scraped off some of the glue, and then hot glued the project to a flat board. Then I ran it through the planer. After I had one flat side, I removed it and ran it through the planer again, but with the other side down this time so that both sides would be flat. And I just did the same thing with the other board. So if you want to see that, just rewind the video 30 seconds and watch it again, because the process was exactly the same. After both boards were flattened, I ran both of them through the planer one more time to make sure they were exactly the same thickness.
Okay, so the next step is I'm gonna have to cut this now. I gotta figure out how I want my line to go in. So I've got these little strips here that I cut, and what I'm doing is I'm pushing my board flat against this fence here just to hold it in place. This makes it easier when you're doing it one person. You don't have anyone else to kind of trace it out while you're doing this. So you can just put your piece wherever you want it to start along here. If you want it to start over here, you can do that, but I'm gonna have mine start somewhere in the middle of this Duke. So I don't want it to be perfectly in the middle. I just want it, because I don't want to have any kind of patterns. Then you're just going to kind of give a twist and kind of bend it until you get the desired kind of weave in there. I think that looks kind of nice like that. So I'm going to go ahead and trace that. So now I've got this nice line that just kind of curves across here. Didn't quite get off the end, so I'm just going to freehand that.
You can see here the first weave cut that I'll be making in just a minute.
So now that I've got my line on one board, I'm going to use some double stick tape, and I'm going to attach these two together, and then I'm going to run them both through the bandsaw at the same time. That way I'll have the same exact cut through both of my boards.
So I put a little piece of double stick tape on each corner, and then I lined up the center of the boards and pressed them together.
I've got these two boards stuck together now, so I'm going to cut through my line here. Hopefully these will perfectly line up when I'm done. And I got to admit, I'm a little nervous about cutting these because if I mess this up, they're junk. There's probably nothing I can do to fix it, but we're going to try. Let's see.
So I proceeded to cut both boards at the same time. And well, it went pretty smoothly. Now that my two boards were now 4 boards, it was time to glue them back together. But first, earlier I had cut some of these thin strips of hard maple, the same thickness as the kerf of the bandsaw blade. This will get sandwiched in between the two halves. Oh, and I didn't tell you this, but I also switched the halves. It might be a mistake, but it's too late now. What you gonna do about it? This time I used some pipe clamps to do the heavy lifting and 2 smaller clamps to keep things aligned. I think 4 clamps would have been enough, but 5 sounded better. Day 3, I removed the clamps and scraped off some of the excess glue. I also cleaned up the edge of that thin strip that I glued in between. Then I ran them through the planer again to flatten both boards out. Then I marked out another curved line, but this time I made sure it was going the opposite direction, kind of mirroring the last one. Then it was time for a little more tape, and back to the bandsaw to cut it apart the second time.
Well, I just made a mistake. When I glued these two pieces together, I accidentally had the pattern going the wrong direction. So you can see on this one, I had the other piece that I cut going through, and I went the other direction with it so that they're kind of weaving across each other. But I had this one, when I glued them, or when I taped them together, this one, I accidentally went the same direction as the previous one. So I'm not really sure how that's gonna look on the next glue up, but I guess we'll find out. So these pieces are going to get glued together on the opposite sides like this, and hopefully they'll turn out okay, even though I messed up. But it's part of new projects and unknowns. Sometimes you got to make the mistake to learn how to not do it again. Definitely something I will remember in the future. But I'm going to glue it together anyway, and then we'll cut it again and see what it looks like.
I didn't show it the first time, but I definitely needed to do some cleanup sanding to make a good tight fit. The key was to sand only a small amount at a time and keep checking the fit. I found that these rounded foam sanding pads worked really well for the concave areas, and a flat sanding pad worked great for the convex sections. So I again glued the opposite halves together. Now, because I keep running these boards through the planer, they are of course getting thinner between each glue up, which caused a small problem when installing the smaller clamps that I was using to align the ends. Since I cut all of my thin strips at the same time and thickness as the rest of my boards, they are getting taller than the rest each time I glue things together. So I used a chisel to notch the end out to make room for the clamps, and this worked really well. Day 4 was pretty much exactly the same thing as day 3. I removed the clamps, scraped them, and ran both boards through the planer. But at this point, the weave pattern was really starting to emerge from its cocoon like a beautiful little butterfly. Fly, little butterfly, fly! Oh yeah.
So this time, before I tape these together and run them through the bandsaw again, I want to make sure that I don't make the same mistake that I did last time. And that is, I made my lines go the same direction on just one board and not the other board. And so this time I'm going to make sure that you can see on this board here that I have the two lines that are coming together, but then they very closely follow each other across. Same with on this one. I've got two that have that nice little like fishtail look to it. And then these two lines over here get kind of close together as they're going through. So I want to make sure that these are both curved in the same direction so that I can start my cut in a different place and weave through the board on both of them in the right direction rather than accidentally having them really close together like this. So even though that was a bit of a mistake, it still looks kind of cool. So let's tape them together and cut them in half.
And tape them I did. I also marked my new pattern line and proceeded to cut them in half. Again. A little more sanding, and then I bet you can't guess what I did next. Oh, you're right. I glued them together again. You're so smart. Oh, yes, you are.
Now we let them dry. Don't mind the rooster. Let them dry, and we'll cut them again, maybe 2 more times.
Cue the montage.
So now that we've got these out of the clamps, you can really see the pattern that is in here, this weave pattern, and how it's coming together. And I've got to admit, it looks a lot better than I was thinking. There's a little bit of a learning curve as far as making sure that I had the same gap running all the way along so that when I put my thin strips in here, that there was no remaining gap. And so making sure to sand it equally all the way across was a little bit of a pain, but honestly, it really worked out well. I'm happy with how these are turning together. Happy with how these are turning out. And I believe that the people that I'm going to be sending these to as gifts are going to be really pleased with them. So, all right, the next step is going to be to run them back through the planer again, and let's do it.
I like to mark my boards with a pencil before running them through the planer so I can see all of the low spots. Then I'm finally done with all of the washing and the rinsing and the repeating and can finally move on to something different. So I used my sled to trim off the ends, giving me a nice square board. Well, I guess it's not square, it's actually a rectangle, but you know what I mean. Next, I set my table saw to 45 degrees, and then I lined up the board with the blade around the halfway mark, give or take. This is really just personal preference at this point as to where you want the bevel to be or not to be. See what I did there? Then I trimmed off the edge, flipped it around, and did the same thing to the other side. Now, on the long sides, you want to try and line up the blade with the previous cut on the ends. But I will intentionally stay back away from the cut mark so I can fine-tune the cut and sneak up on it. So it'll come out just perfectly. This usually takes a few tries, but well worth the time. Now for the really exciting part of sanding. But I'm not going to bore you with that. So, real quickly, I make sure to mark all sides of the board before each different grit of sandpaper so I don't have to sand any more than I need to. I started off with some 100 grit sandpaper, followed up with some 120 grit, then 150 grit, and then 180 grit sandpaper. I almost got you with that one, didn't I? And lastly, some 220 grit sandpaper. Okay, now before I do my final sanding, I want to make sure to clean off any dust from the boards like I definitely remembered to do between each grit of sandpaper. Then I raised the grain with a little water pop, but showing you that now will definitely spoil the surprise, so you'll have to wait. But I have to say, they look good. A tip here is to use some paint sticks to lift the boards off the table and allow them to dry more evenly. Once they have dried, I hit them again with some 220 grit sandpaper by hand, and it only takes 1 or 2 passes to knock down the wood fibers. This is also when I'll knock off any sharp edges or corners. I wanted to let you know that I read all of the comments, so start your comment off by telling me which board you like the most so I know you made it this far. And don't forget to hit that like button and maybe think about subscribing, but no pressure. Now it's time to apply the finish. There are a lot of different options to choose from, but here I'm using some walrus board wax. Now, I don't know how they get the wax from a walrus, but I imagine they use a really big Q-tip. Or perhaps a shovel. Gross. I try not to think about it. Anyways, let's skip to the glamour shots. Ooh. Ah. If you liked this video, I know you'll like my 16th century charcuterie board build. Click the link and I'll see you there.